I'm writing down all the EQ spots, trying to match the same thing, bring it back up, and it never sounds the same.
Mic check 1 2, microphone check 1 2, mic check 1 2, microphone check 1 2.
It's another studio build. So this one's gonna be a big one. All this is gonna be different. And it's gonna be a long preamble. I just wanna warn you, if you wanna skip to the action, look in the description. All of this, as cool as it looks, is not, that's not working. And so I'm just gonna go through the whole thing of how I got to all of this. So going way back to when I was 13 years old, I had a Pearl Export drum set. I had a Gibson Les Paul Jr. guitar, Fender Twin reverb amp that I got at a pawn shop. And I had a stereo, the way that people used to have stereos with 2 tape decks in it. And I made a whole album of recording. First of all, I recorded the drum parts. I don't remember exactly how I recorded the drums, but somehow I recorded the drums onto a cassette tape. And I recorded the drums first because, you know, it's the basis, but then also it would be the loudest thing, because everything else that I would record, because I would record one thing and then dub it from one side of the tape recorder to the other side in the stereo. It was just like a consumer stereo. And everything that you would record over would get a lot quieter. So I went with the loudest thing first, the drums. I made a whole album like that. It sounded terrible. I made tapes of it. I gave it to all my friends. And everybody was like, this is awful. But it's amazing that you did this with this equipment that you have. How did you do that? And I'm not exactly sure how I did it, but I made an album. And I knew I liked doing it right away. But I had no idea. Rural Alabama is where I was from. This was before the internet or any of this kind of stuff. Had no idea how to make an album, how you record music. So fast forward, I went to college after high school at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and they had this really cool program called Music Technology. And it was a hybrid program of like recording technology. So you took like recording classes in the studio, but then it was also like making music with computers. The first class I took was called Computer Music 101, making music with microcomputers. And we used Finale, and we used not even Performer, digital Performer, we used Performer, like the little brother to Performer. It was kind of, we used these little Apple Mac classics on a workstation, and that's how you did it. And I loved it. I thought it was great. I lived in an apartment. I played music. I didn't have any kind of money for any sort of gear. Fast forward after that, I moved to New York City, and I definitely didn't have any room for anything. And all I had was a MOJO 8 Pre Firewire, a MacBook Pro, a Boss SP303 sampler, a 6-channel Behringer mixer, like the cheapest one that you can get, which worked great. It was awesome. I had an Alesis effects processor that I think only had reverb and delay, and then maybe just a few other things. And I recorded that into Digital Performer, and that's how I made music then. And I would have to take all of that stuff and drag it out and then put it under the bed because there was no room. In the meantime, I had always wanted like a large format console, and I had read so many interviews and articles with people talking about analog summing, how great analog summing is, and that's the only way to go. If you know Mixer Man, if you look up everything Mixer Man said, I believe everything Mixer Man said. And I'm not saying Mixer Man's wrong about the analog summing, but I just didn't know. Like, I didn't have it sounded like that was the way to go. I didn't have a point of reference to say like, well, maybe I don't need all that. It sounded like if you want the best way to do it and the best quality you could do, this is how to do it. So of course in Manhattan, I had no room for all of that kind of stuff. Then we moved out to Queens and had a little more space. after a good number of years. And I had my same Genelec monitors that I have here, my second set now. Those were my only monitors then. And I read all these articles about the Yamaha PM2000 console. It's got kind of like a cult following to it because it was made to really high standards. People at one point called it lovingly the Japanese because it's not quite accurate. The EQs were based off the Neve 1073 or gyrator EQs instead of inductor, but there was a mod that you could do to each channel. There was like $50 for one channel that you could make it an inductor EQ. And then the rest of the topology of the console, the op amps were based on API 990 op amps. It's a really well-made console, and the cool thing about that console was that it was made to be like the most high-end live large format console for live shows. So it meant that you could turn it on and off like every day. And that's huge for like just a personal studio where you're not you don't have to have it on all the time for whatever reason and can justify that expense. But most of those large format consoles, it's like if you turn them off, they don't like that. You turn it back on and something's not going to work right. So it was great. It had some problems with it in the sense that it didn't have like a proper two bus. There was not an actual stereo bus, and then it had subgroups that you could designate as a stereo bus, but they didn't sound quite as good as the other channels, and on and on, different things. There's not like a monitor out. So you also have to designate another submix for your monitor mix. But for what it is, it's pretty awesome. And they definitely don't make things like that today. So, I mean, unless you're going to spend literally hundreds of thousands, $100,000 or something. But the console that I got into before that, I started reading about the Allen & Heath. Allen & Heath came out with this GSR 24M, and the M designation was motorized faders, so it had automation. So I was reading all about this, and no transformers, and so none of that kind of mojo. It had 2 valve channels or 2 tube channels in it, so that was nice. But the really cool thing about that is that you could, from what I had read, you were able to sum analog on the desk and have your automation moves in Pro Tools and be able to sum analog and mix analog before it goes into the DAW. So you were basically bypassing the DAW faders, the DAW faders, and mixing analog on the console. And the only thing about that was, that I later found out, is you had to send through a pre-fader send through every single DAW channel to all of the channels on the desk. So that meant that for a 24 channel desk, you had to have 24 sends in Pro Tools. That's fine in Pro Tools. In Ableton, that's totally doesn't work at all. Every channel's just filled with a whole bunch of sends on there. But more so than that, you were able to do this, and it was basically like the functionality of an SSL AWS it was pricey. When it first came out, it was like $12,000. That also had a 32 channel audio interface built in. But I ended up getting that console used, basically brand new, for $8,000. I sold a whole bunch of stuff to get it because I was convinced that that was the way to go with analog summing and everything, and I was super happy to get it. It took a lot. And so I got it, and I got everything set up, and I started doing my mixes and making my music, and it was great. I loved it. It did exactly what I imagined it to do. And then one day it had a feature where you could also do a digital mix next to your analog mix, and through the touch of one button, one switch, you could switch back and forth between your in the box mix and your analog mix to monitor it. And so after maybe several months of making my analog mixes and my analog summing, and it did sound great, I decided to do a shootout between the digital mix and my analog summed mix. And I would just want to say, first of all, that the music that I'm making is like electronic music. Now, if you're making just straight up Rolling Stones kind of rock music with those kind of instruments and that kind of sound, it may be different, because that's really where those kind of instruments need this sort of extra juice or something to make them sound like the albums that you're used to hearing, because that's how they were recorded. Even with that, though, I don't really believe that anymore. I don't really believe that's true. I think you can do it with plugins, which is what I'm getting to, because here's what happened when I did the A-B mix, the A-B shootout between the digital mix and the analog mix. Right away, the digital mix sounded, for one thing, louder, which immediately makes it sound better. But it did sound more clear. It sounded wider. It sounded deeper. It sounded more open and three-dimensional somehow. And those are usually the things that people say about the analog sum mix, that's how it sounds. And I had exactly the opposite experience. I thought, well, let me try it again. Let me do another piece of music and do the same thing. And every time, over and over, I liked the digital mix better. And not just by a little bit. I was like, this definitely sounds more like what I want it to sound like. This sounds better. And it was kind of at that point my heart sank, because it was like, wow, I went through all this trouble. I sold a bunch of photography gear and did all this to get this console and do the analog summing the way that I had been reading about it from Mixer Man and all these people talking about it and everything. And that my personal experience with it was, I'm not just that I'm content with the digital mix, but I like it better. So then it was like, well, why am I really going to all this trouble of not being able to have instant recall on the console, having to have one project open at a time. Yeah, you can get the fader moves to come back up when you open up the DAW, but all your EQs and everything else, you got to go back in and say, I've got a sheet there that I'm writing down all the EQ spots, trying to match the same thing, bring it back up, and it never sounds the same. Never. You basically just have to start over. And then it doesn't quite sound as good. So I sold that console, and I was so happy to see that one go, to be honest. And I had really been into it. You can go back and watch some of my other videos where I was using it, and it's not that it sounded bad. It sounded really good, but it just, for all the trouble of using it, it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. It wasn't bringing to my music what I felt would justify keeping it at all, and it introduced many barriers, things that would slow me down in my process that I didn't need. So I got rid of that. Really happy to do it. So then, in the meantime of all that, I had found a really great deal down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, on a YAMAHA PM2000 in great condition. I got that console, long story short. I had a new power supply built for it, because that's kind of the one thing that's sort of weak on the original ones, and everybody recommends to do that. And that console did sound amazing. It had that big console sound that the Allen and Heath didn't. But I mean, I didn't dislike the Allen and Heath because of the sound of it, so far as like the sound of the channel strips and the preamps and the fact that it didn't have the transformers and all that. That wasn't what I was missing in that at all. If anything, it was closer to a more transparent kind of Neotech sound, the way that like Steve Albini likes those Neotechs, precisely because they don't have transformers and all this stuff in there, and like you can do that in another way. But the PM2000 had the MOJO, the analog MOJO this way, but definitely then when I would do analog summing on that, I definitely didn't like it as much because it was coloring the sound in a way that was not what I was wanting to do, and I could do that with plugins. And I did a whole thing of trying to figure out the plugins that I liked that would get me the same kind of sound if I wanted it, and it wasn't really that hard to do. It didn't sound exactly the same, but it sounded good enough for sure. And so then there were things about that console that were slowing me down, and it was like taking up a lot of space. There's a lot of maintenance that goes into it. There were already many channels that weren't working properly. I'd already had work done to it with the power supply, building a brand new power supply. And then it was like, well, just so many things that seemed like I don't really need that anymore in order to make my music. And I watched this video with Brian Eno, who I love. He's one of my heroes. And it was in his studio. You can see it on YouTube. And his whole workstation there was a standing desk with 2 monitors, 2 speakers, and he's running Logic. And everything he's making, all the music, he's making it in Logic. And he's using scripts and all this to make indeterminate or music with an element of chance in it. But that didn't matter. What I liked was the functionality of the studio and just the fact that he used the computer, and it was the rest of his studio was for something else. Like he's got a room for making art pieces out of LED lights, and he's got a lot of books, and it's not just filled up with all this music gear that it's hard for me not to feel like that's a whole lot of stuff that's like that you don't need in order to make music. And I watched this video with Stimming one time, the techno artist who I also love, and he was talking about like how when he makes music, he doesn't want to have it like he's got a lot of gear, but he would use one thing at a time, and he would just like take it out of the closet, put it on the table, make his work with that, and then put that away. And he said, if I have too many things out there, it just sort of, I don't know, I forget how he phrased it, but basically it would, having so many pieces of equipment out there would slow down the process and like confuse the direction of getting the piece done. And I kind of feel that way too. The pieces, I sold a lot of stuff, but all the stuff that I have back here, I like all this stuff, but none of it is set up in a way that I feel like I can use it. I got to lean over this little Allen and Heath desk here that I have, which is great. And the reason that I did want a console, some kind of console, is because it's sort of the cheapest way of getting a lot of microphone preamps. And so I like to be able to multi-track record the drums, and I can pull that up on the console there. Still have some other channels for send effects to come in and use the send returns to be able to apply those, just reverb and whatnot to a lot of different channels. Even with all that, though, I think there's a lot of ways that I feel in the future I could go about doing that and get rid of that too. Things like the RME, I forget what it's called, but the one with the 12 mic preamps that uses either Dante or MADI or ABV technologies, so that you're doing doing the networks and all this stuff. Anyway, the point is, all this is not really working for me, and I really have other things that I would like to do. Like, I'm doing a lot of stuff with visual art, and I want to incorporate the music that I'm doing with the visual art kind of creation and graphic scores. So I've got all this crap all over the floor here with like ink and pencils and brushes and paint and just a lot of stuff. And then all of this is not getting used because it's like I can't get to my electron stuff over here the way that I want to. Being able to use the Vermona through the DOEPFER SCHALTWERK, that's okay, but you know, I've also found I love the SCHALTWERK. I wanted that for a long time, and then I found that, you know what, I could just program the Vermona with MIDI and still have more control than what the SCHALTWERK does. It's fun and it's quick to be able to like make your sequence with the buttons on the SCHALTWERK, but I mean, I could do that in the DAW too. The point being is that we're going to build a studio and redo everything. It's going to be a long process, but I think what I want to have is a standing desk over here. Maybe have this monitor up on the wall here. My issues are about being able to monitor and have the desk up here with the monitors in a place where I can stand and move around but still be able to have sweet spot of the monitoring. And then also like this enormous keyboard here, I mean, it's just a MIDI controller. It's the DOEPFER LMK4 Plus, and I love the action of it and the feel. So like all those film composers, a lot of film composers use this, and in the course of having the large format consoles and going through that whole thing, the other idea of a studio that I had always really loved was like, you see like Danny Elfman, you see Hans Zimmer, and the way that they have their studios built to just like sit in a chair, do most of the work that you're doing through the DAW, and have it all laid out there in front of you. I'd always really loved that approach and wanted to have a studio like that. And so my idea was, when getting rid of the large format consoles, was to go in that direction, and I did set it up this way, and that's nice. That's okay, but that's still not exactly what I want. I feel like I'm kind of getting away from the idea of wanting to make music in a way that you've got to sit and like craft every little part and every note. And I'm kind of going back toward the idea of a lot more music made quickly with elements of chance and things that are kind of outside the realm of your own imagination, things that you wouldn't really think of that would happen in the music, and through a series of events that you kind of set up and parameters, whether that be chaining effects together in a way that is unknown, or it is using sequencers in a way that has randomness built into it, like what's the one that I like here, the DOEPFER A149-1 RCV, which is based on like the Buchla element of uncertainty, like these kind of things that you're not crafting every note that you're putting down for the piece of music you're writing, but are unknown to you until the parameters you set up realize the music. And so that doesn't really require a large keyboard like this and all of this kind of thing. So I'm not exactly sure where all that's going to go, but I know that the way that this is set up right now, I don't like it. I can't get, it doesn't feel comfortable using the modular or the electrons or the Vermona, and those are the few pieces that I have whittled everything down to say I do like these, I'm going to keep these, and I want to be able to use them. I thought it would be cool to have the electrons in a rack like this, but I think I like it better on a table. and maybe in front of the modular so that you kind of can work both of those, and on wheels so that you can move all this stuff around. This is the idea, and we'll see what happens. Okay, stay tuned.